Hello students, this is Keanu Reeves. Just kidding, it's not Keanu Reeves. Remember that I tried to make a joke about the Matrix in the last chapter lecture video and I forgot the name of the actor and totally screwed up the joke? Well, his name was Keanu Reeves, so I apologize for that. Anyway, this is not Keanu Reeves, this is Dr. Lyons, because of course, who else would it be? And in this chapter, we're going to talk about photosynthesis. So that is, as you might remember, that's the process by which plants take energy from the sun and they use it to make energy in the form of glucose, of sugars. And what you see here is a picture that I took. This is what one particular type of coral reef looks like in the Caribbean. So in places like Florida or the Bahamas or like Mexico. Uh, and so corals, why they kind of fit in here is that even though corals are animals, so they don't photosynthesize, they do have very small plants that live inside of them that photosynthesize. And the only reason why coral reefs can exist is because of these tiny plants that use photosynthesis that help out their corals that they live inside of. So there'll be a lot more talk about corals because they're pretty much my favorite type of ecosystem. So if you're excited to learn more about corals, then you're in luck. And if you don't like corals, well, tough rocks. So first is kind of a preview. What is photosynthesis? Why is it important? And do we rely on it? So photosynthesis, just as a general kind of overview, is the process by which plants take energy from the sun, and they take that energy and they convert it into chemical energy in the form of sugars. Okay, why is it important? Well, it's important because sugars are really, really important, right? So sugars are the main way that plants produce structure, right? So for instance, we talked about cellulose. Cellulose is a type of sugar that plants use to give themselves their three-dimensional structure. That's what the cell walls of plants are made of. It's important because glucose and other sugars are the main source of dietary energy for animals such as us. And where do we get all of that sugar from? We get it from plants. So do we rely on photosynthesis? Absolutely. If it wasn't for photosynthesis, animals just would not exist on this planet. And animals, including us, we just couldn't exist because plants, take that sunlight and convert it into, chemical energy that we can then use to function with our own bodies. So if it wasn't for plants undergoing photosynthesis, then we just wouldn't exist. So first, kind of some basics about photosynthesis. Right, as I just said, it's a transformation of light energy into chemical energy in the form of sugars. Right, so it is used by plants. It's used by algae, which is a type of protist, and it's used by certain types of bacteria. So these are things that we refer to as autotroph. So the suffix troph means to eat. And the prefix auto means something that happens on its own without any need to do anything to it. So for instance, like the automatic transmission of a car is a transmission that where the gears will shift on their own. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to worry about a clutch or a shift in order to shift the gears, right? So an automatic transmission does it on its own, whereas a manual shift transmission, you actually have to change the gears yourself. So autotrophs are things that produce food on their own. They don't need to get food from anywhere else, right? So these are plants, algae, and some bacteria, meaning that they can just take the sunlight and make their own sugars from it. We, in contrast, are heterotrophs. So the prefix hetero means other or different. Troph, again, means to eat. So heterotrophs are organisms that need to eat other organisms because we can't produce our own sugars, right? We just can't, go outside, and stand out in the sun and take our clothes off and absorb the energy from the sun and make sugars from it. Because like I said in a previous lecture, you get arrested for that. And also it just doesn't work. There are, I should mention, some autotrophic, heterotrophic, weird things. So corals, for instance, are kind of in that category. So corals themselves are heterotrophs, but they have autotrophs that live inside of them. So when you look at a coral, you're kind of looking at part autotroph, part heterotroph. But for the most part, life on this planet is either heterotrophic or autotrophic. So for instance, this Joshua tree, it's an autotroph. These kelp, this type of algae, those are autotrophs. This fish here, which is a Garibaldi, the state fish of California, it is a heterotroph. And you are a heterotroph. Okay, so some more basics about photosynthesis. So here's the chemical reaction, right? So we have the products, we have the reactants over here on the left and the products over right on the right. So we take carbon dioxide and water, we take some energy from light, and what is produced in photosynthesis is glucose, so a sugar, and oxygen gas. So what I want you to do is I want you to take a look at your notes from the last chapter and look at the chemical reaction for cellular respiration. So you should notice something about that that is interesting when you compare it to the reaction that you see going on here. If you haven't noticed it yet, what is going on is that the two reactions are opposite of each other. So in cellular respiration, we take glucose and we take oxygen that we breathe. We break down that glucose and remove energy from it in order to produce ATP. And what is produced as a byproduct is water and carbon dioxide that we exhale. Photosynthesis goes the very opposite. For photosynthesis, the reactants, so carbon dioxide and water, are the products of cellular respiration. So this works out really well for all of us living things on the planet, because we have things that can photosynthesize, and then we have cellular respiration that's done by pretty much everything on this planet, including the photosynthesizers. And this works out well because photosynthesis produces oxygen, and cellular respiration needs oxygen, and cellular respiration produces carbon dioxide, and photosynthesis needs carbon dioxide. So we have this really good system going on here where photosynthesis and cellular respiration work in opposite ways from each other, which essentially allows the other to keep going on and on. So that's really important. Okay, so we can't talk about photosynthesis without talking a little bit about chloroplasts. So chloroplasts, we talked about them very briefly back in chapter 4. We talked about how they're like the solar panels of the cell. So they are the area where photosynthesis takes place. And these are found mostly on the leaves of plants, right? Any of the parts of a plant that are green, that's where you're finding chloroplasts. And for the most part, they're mostly concentrated in the leaves, which makes sense because leaves are found where? In the top part of the plant that is closest to the sun. And so inside of chloroplasts, there is chlorophyll, which is a type of pigment. And that is what is actually doing the capturing of the light. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Chloroplasts, like mitochondria, which we talked about in the last chapter, they have a double membrane system as well. And in fact, what we're going to talk about that goes on inside of chloroplasts is not actually that different from what goes on inside of mitochondria. So here's kind of an image to kind of show you these various levels, right? So we have a leaf. If we were to cut a leaf, as a cross section, you would have these cells on the top that have a very high concentration of chloroplasts in them. The cells on the bottom have that too, but they're not as highly concentrated of chloroplasts. The obvious reason is that light goes in through the top. On the bottom of leaves, we have these holes known as stomata. And those holes are what allow air to go in and out. And the two bits of air that we're really concerned about here is carbon dioxide and oxygen. So carbon dioxide has to be able to go in because that is a reactant of photosynthesis. Oxygen needs to be able to get out because oxygen is a product of photosynthesis. If we then take a closer look at one of those cells, right? So we see a cell there that has a whole bunch of chloroplasts in it, right? Each of these green things are the chloroplasts. If we then blow up that chloroplast, we see there's an inner and outer membrane of the chloroplast. And inside of it, we have these things that are each individually known as thylakoids. And so they're kind of like these little green stacks. They're like little green poker chips that are stacked one on top of the other on top of the other. A whole big stack of one of them, a whole big stack of these thylakoid are called granums. And this is where things are mainly taking place. This is where photosynthesis is going on for the most part, is inside of the thylakoid. Okay, so we talked a little bit now about chloroplast. I want to talk now a little bit more about the pigments that are inside of chloroplast that allow this to take place. And I want to talk a little bit more about the nature of light. So first, let's talk about the nature of light. So light comes in a spectrum of wavelengths, right? So like a lot of things, light is part of a whole spectrum of wavelengths. So for instance, radio waves, those are actual waves that are part of this same continuum of wavelengths. X-rays are also waves that are also part of this continuum of wavelengths. So X-rays are down here, right? So they're kind of on this end, and radio waves are going to be out on this end. So there's this sweet spot in the middle that are these wavelengths of light that we can actually perceive. So wavelengths that are between 400 nanometers and 700 nanometers approximately is what we can actually view. Right? So this is what's known as the visible light spectrum. And you've probably heard this referred to by an acronym, right? The acronym ROY-G-BIV. So ROY-G-BIV refers to red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Right? So those are the colors that we can actually perceive with our eyes. Right? We can't see anything up beyond that. Right? You can't see radio waves, and you can't see X-rays. It is worth mentioning that some other animals can actually perceive this. Right? So snakes and a lot of lizards, for instance, can perceive what's known as infrared. So that would be light that is out beyond here that we can't see. And a lot of fishes can view what's known as ultraviolet light, which is down in this area. But we can only perceive this light here. Okay, so another really important aspect of light that I want to teach you about here has to do with light being absorbed and being reflected. So in the air around you, there are all of these different wavelengths of light in that air. Those wavelengths of light, bounce into or strike objects. So say, say right now, for instance, you are wearing a red T-shirt. What is going on with your red T-shirt is that all of the wavelengths of light are in the air around your T-shirt, and they are running into your T-shirt. What happens is that red light bounces off of that T-shirt and goes back out into the air. The other colors like violet and indigo and blue and green and yellow and orange, all of those colors are absorbed by your T-shirt. So when we look at an object, what we're actually seeing is the light that is bouncing off of that object. You're not seeing the light that is absorbed by it, you're seeing the light that bounces off of it, which makes sense. There's red light in the atmosphere. It bounces off of your red T-shirt, and then it goes back out into the air and into your eyeballs, and you perceive that object, your T-shirt, as being red. So when you look at an object, what you're actually seeing is the light that is bouncing off of it. What you're not seeing is the light that is absorbed by that object. So an object that is red is reflecting red and absorbing the other colors. An object that is green is reflecting green and absorbing the other colors. Right? So think about a leaf of a typical plant. It tends to be greenish, right? And what that means is that leaf is reflecting green. So it's not actually using green, it's reflecting it. And it's absorbing the other bits of light, the indigo and the violet and the blue and the orange and the red. So it's reflecting green and not using it, and it's absorbing and using the other colors. So now let's talk about how pigments factor into this. So there's three different pigments I want to talk about. So chlorophyll A is the main pigment that is used here. So it is the main pigment that actually captures photons of light. How I kind of think of well, I'll talk about this analogy in a minute. So it's what is absorbing the light here. Okay, and so chlorophyll A, it will absorb colors that are like purplish, indigo, a little bit of blue, and then kind of reddish and orangish. Chlorophyll B acts in a similar way, but it's not the main pigment. What it does is when it gets energy from a photon of light, it actually gives that energy to chlorophyll A. So it kind of passes that energy to chlorophyll A. And then finally, there's a whole bunch of other types of pigments that are sometimes referred to as accessory pigments. So carotenoids are one type of such accessory pigment. And what they kind of do is they protect the chlorophyll. So they keep the chlorophyll from getting damaged by light that is coming in. So things like beta carotene, lycopene, carotene, these are types of carotenoids. And what carotenoids do is they absorb light that is indigo, violet, blue, and kind of the bluish greens of bluish shades of green. So they kind of absorb light in this area and they reflect this light. So in general, carotenoids have kind of a orangish appearance because they're reflecting all of this light up here. Kind of the average color in between them is orange. So carotenoids give plants a kind of orangish color, whereas chlorophyll A and B, they give plants kind of a greenish color because they are reflecting green, but they're absorbing kind of yellow, orange, red, and violet, indigo, and blue. So this kind of relates to fall foliage, right? So we don't have fall foliage too much here in Southern California. We do have a few trees that do change color. So for instance, in a lot of areas in the valley, a type of tree known as a Chinese sycamore has been planted. In those trees, they're very, very green through the summer, but then they do actually turn into a bright red color in say December in January. And so why fall foliage happens has to do with chlorophyll. So typically during the growing season, a plant is photosynthesizing a lot. So it's using a lot of chlorophyll to photosynthesize. And because there's so much chlorophyll in there, you don't really see the carotenoids. The carotenoids are there, but you just don't see them because they're kind of being superseded and drowned out by the chlorophyll. But what happens in the fall and the winter is that the day length gets shorter, it gets colder, and the plant stops photosynthesizing. So essentially what plants do is they stop producing chlorophyll. And when that chlorophyll goes away, now you can actually see the carotenoids. So what you're seeing here, like this plant right here that is bright orange, all of its chlorophyll has gone away. And now what you can actually see is the carotenoids. The carotenoids were there through the summer, but it's just that there was so much chlorophyll that you couldn't see them. So that is why fall foliage happens. And like I said, we don't get too much of it here in Southern California. But if you ever have a chance to go to the Midwest or the Northeast of North America, in the fall time, I highly recommend it because it is really, really quite beautiful. I grew up in an area that in Massachusetts where there is really, really beautiful, stunning fall foliage. And it is definitely one of the things I miss the most about the Northeast. But on the other side, they get, feet and feet of snow every winter, and that sucks. So I miss it, but not that much. Okay, so let's do a little overview of photosynthesis. So there are two types, or there are two stages of this that we are going to talk about. So there are what are known as the light reactions and what is known as the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle is often also referred to as the dark reactions. So you can probably guess the light reactions need light, the dark reactions do not need light. And like cellular respiration, these two processes are kind of related to each other. So the light reactions are going to produce ATP and NADPH. As a refresher, NADPH, that was like the Uber for electrons. So these yellow circles here are electrons. And so we're going to produce NADPH and ATP, and that's going to then be used in the Calvin cycle. And then once we use those products up, we end up with NADP plus and ADP. Those go back into the light reactions where we make more ATP and NADPH. And what we have going on in terms of products and byproducts is we have water goes into light reactions, oxygen comes out. This is of course really important because all of the oxygen that you are breathing right now comes from this right here. And the carbon dioxide that you exhale then gets used by plants as part of the Calvin cycle. And sugar is then produced, and any sugar that you've ever eaten has come from this process right here. Okay, so first let's get into the light reactions. So first of all, let's orient you to what you're looking at, because I know this is a kind of a complex diagram. So we are inside of a chloroplast, and what you see, this kind of gray thing here, this is one thylakoid. And so we have this inside space inside of the thylakoid, and then we have this space on the outside of the thylakoid. That space is known as the stroma. And what is going to take place here is pretty similar to what took place in the electron transport chain. So this might be a good time if you don't really remember what we talked about in the last chapter, in chapter 6 about the electron transport chain. It might be a good time to pause the video and take a look back at your notes about that, because you're going to see that this process that we're going to talk about here is very, very similar to that process. Okay, so what we start off with is water, right? Plants need water, and you have to water your plants. And why they need water is that water is where electrons are going to come from that are used in this process. So electrons are taken from water. When we do that, we produce oxygen, or not we produce oxygen, plants produce oxygen. So this is where that oxygen is being made as a byproduct. It's a byproduct to plants because they don't need it. But it's very, very useful to us because we need to breathe oxygen for cellular respiration. So all of the oxygen that is in the atmosphere comes from this, right? So pretty much every breath that you've ever taken in your entire life has come from a plant and come from this right here, from the very simple process of taking water, removing electrons from it, and making oxygen. So this electron sits inside of a photosystem. A photosystem is this cluster of pigment cells, not cells, a cluster of pigments. And those pigments are the things we just talked about, right? So chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, carotenoids, that's what those are. So we have pigments that are sitting inside of these photosystems. And those pigments, as we talked about, they absorb energy from the light, right? I kind of think of those pigments as like little outfielders on a baseball team. And these photons of light are like little baseballs that are going out into the outfield. And the outfielders catch those little photons of light. And so what those pigments do when they catch these photons of light is they take that energy and they transfer it to the electron. So something that we haven't talked about up until now is the fact that electrons can be at a resting stable state and they can be at an excited state. You can kind of think of them as like little children. So if a child, when a child is, say it's the afternoon and they're getting kind of tired, they're in a very stable, non-excited state. Let's say let's say you're a really adventurous parent and you feed that child a bunch of sugar and coffee. Now they're going to be in an excited state. And when they're in an excited state, that's when they have the capacity to maybe do some work. That's when you send that child out into the yard to rake the leaves or to take out the garbage or do whatever. So these electrons, they get into an excited state when they get some energy from light. Those electrons then go through a series of proteins through an electron transport chain. And what these proteins do is they pump hydrogen ions, right? Just like we talked about in the electron transport chain back during cellular respiration in chapter 6, The same exact thing is going on here. So hydrogen ions are being pumped from outside the thylakoid to the inside of the thylakoid. And how they're doing it is that these proteins are getting energy from these electrons that are excited. Why these electrons are excited is because they've gotten some energy from sunlight. So electrons go through this chain. Hydrogen ions are pumped into this space. The electrons then go into a second photosystem where they then get another boost of energy from some light. At which point the electron is then put onto NADP+, right? And that was like the little Uber for electrons that we talked about. NADP+, when you give it to electrons, now it's NADPH. And this little Uber for electrons is then going to go to the Calvin cycle, which will then be the next stage that we will talk about. So, but let's return to these hydrogen ions, right? So they're in a high concentration inside of the thylakoid, which means that they want to diffuse back to the outside, back to the stroma, because that's what things do. They diffuse from high concentration to low concentration. So the same ATP synthase that we talked about in the last chapter is going to operate here, right? So ATP synthase is a protein, and what it does is it takes the kinetic energy of hydrogen ions moving through it, and it converts that kinetic energy into chemical energy in the form of ATP. So just like we talked about in the last chapter, this ATP synthase is going to synthesize ATP. And so that ATP, along with the NADPH, is going to go to the Calvin cycle. And that is where the sugar is then going to be actually produced. Right, so you can kind of think of, how I kind of think of the light reactions and the dark reactions is that the light reactions they're kind of like a little, a little power plant. Say like a little, solar power plant that is producing electricity. That electricity can then be used by a factory, which would be the Calvin cycle, for making products like, I don't know, tires or cars or windows or whatever, right? So the light reactions are like the little solar panels that then give electricity that allows a factory to make some sort of product. Okay, so let's talk about that factory, the Calvin cycle. So this, like I said, is also known as the dark reactions because you don't need light for this to take place. Okay, so we have some ATP going in, that's right there. We have some NADPH going in right there. Some more ATP going in right there. So these were the products of the light reaction. So this is what the light reactions made. So we have those things going in, and we have carbon dioxide from the air going in, right? So this is why plants need to breathe carbon dioxide from the air around them, because carbon dioxide is the sort of raw material that plants use to make sugars. You can kind of think of the carbon dioxide, if we continue with this sort of factory analogy, the carbon dioxide, those are like the raw materials that are used to make some sort of product. Say we're talking about a factory that makes windows. This is like the glass that is melted and shaped into a window. And the ATP and the NADPH, that is like the electricity that allows that factory to operate, that allows it to run. So what happens is carbon dioxide comes in and it goes through this cycle. And essentially what it does is it goes through this cycle 3 times, and that produces what's known as G3P, so a 3-carbon sugar that then can be combined with another 3-carbon sugar to make glucose, or it can be combined with other things to make other types of organic compounds. So every 3 times we go around this, we make 1 G3P sugar. So essentially every 6 times we go through this cycle, we produce 1 glucose molecule. And I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on at each step here. We're not going to talk about the enzymes that are making all of this take place and whatnot. What I really just want you to know is that carbon dioxide goes in as a raw material. And ATP and NADPH is what then allows for G3P to be made. And G3P is what then is used to make glucose. So this is the Calvin cycle. And so what you see coming out of here is essentially every sugar that you've ever consumed in your entire life. Right? So all the sugars that plants make, that's where the sugars come from that, when we eat plants or when we eat processed sugars or when we eat animals that have eaten other plants. It all comes down to this right here. Okay, so I wanted to talk about just two things real quick. The first thing I wanted to talk about is the carbon cycle. And I think this is a useful thing to talk about here because this is a good way to link together what you've learned about just now in photosynthesis and what you learned about in the last chapter in cellular respiration. So what the carbon cycle kind of describes is the path that a atom of carbon takes as it moves throughout moves throughout the Earth, essentially. So we can think of carbon as starting out in the atmosphere in the format of carbon dioxide. Plants take that carbon dioxide because they need it for the dark reactions. They need it for the Calvin cycle. And what they do is they essentially convert that carbon dioxide into sugars. Those sugars then go up through food webs, right? So things that are primary consumers, what are otherwise known as herbivores, they eat the plants, and then omnivores or carnivores come along and eat those herbivores. So that carbon that is in the form of a sugar now is moving up and up through food webs. And as it's going through those food webs, a couple things occur, right? So all of these things, so plants and animals, they all are undergoing cellular respiration, right? Because plants, an important point here is that plants are just like us in that even though they produce sugars, they still need ATP in order to function. So even though plants produce sugars, they still undergo cellular respiration to convert those sugars into ATP. So they are undergoing cellular respiration. This lynx is undergoing cellular respiration. This hare is undergoing cellular respiration, meaning that all of them are consuming sugars, consuming oxygen, and releasing carbon dioxide, which goes back into the atmosphere. And another thing that happens as sugars go up through food webs is that these things die. Right, so these things die, and we know that the Earth isn't just covered by a bunch of dead things that came before us. These dead things get eaten by decomposers, by things like bacteria and fungus. In those bacteria, in those fungi, they undergo cellular respiration just like us, meaning that they eat all of this dead stuff, and what they do is they release carbon dioxide through cellular respiration. So they're releasing carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, right? So carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. Plants take it in, make sugars from it. Those sugars go through food webs, and things consume it. Decomposers consume it, and then through cellular respiration, carbon dioxide goes back up into the atmosphere. So we have this kind of loop cycle going on through here, where carbon dioxide goes through this continuous loop that links together cellular respiration and photosynthesis. Of course, now where things are getting a little bit different is that sometimes when plants and animals die, they become, they don't get completely decomposed, and they turn into oil that is in the ground. So that oil is stored in the ground, and that's a big storage place for carbon in the ground. When we burn fossil fuels, essentially we're taking that oil that would otherwise be stored in the ground, and we are releasing that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Right, so that's why we have more and more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now, is because carbon that would have been stored, underground is now being released into the atmosphere. It's essentially being put back into the loop. Right, so that carbon had been taken out of the loop, but now it's being put back into this whole loop. Okay, one last thing I want to talk about uh, is why photosynthesis is important to climate change. Right, so we just talked about with the carbon cycle why climate change is kind of occurring is because carbon that would otherwise be taken, other carbon that is outside of the carbon cycle that is stored in the earth is being put back into the carbon cycle by burning of fossil fuels. So the carbon cycle relates to climate change, as does photosynthesis. But there's another reason why photosynthesis relates to climate change, right? So think about what it is that plants are doing, right? So what do plants take in from the atmosphere in order to make the Calvin cycle go? So what they're taking in is they're taking in carbon dioxide. So so what plants do is they kind of act as a is a natural is a natural army against climate change, because plants have the unique capacity to take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, to remove the carbon dioxide that is in the atmosphere that is acting as a greenhouse gas and heating up our atmosphere and causing our climate to change. Right, so all various things that photosynthesize are helping us with climate change, which is why scenes like this are really sad, because obviously there was a continuous set of forest along here with all these trees that were sucking up carbon dioxide and helping with climate change, but now they're not there anymore, right? So things like deforestation, that's really bad because those plants are really useful for combating climate change. Right, so this is kind of getting at, kind of something that I want to be clear to you throughout the semester. A lot of the things that we're talking about are very much related to each other, right? So cellular respiration and photosynthesis, they are very much linked to each other by the carbon cycle. And climate change is related to both of those things because plants take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere using photosynthesis. So you'll see that throughout the semester, there's a lot of different topics that we're going to cover that are very much going to be related to each other. And kind of understanding how those topics relate is how you're going to get a better kind of holistic understanding of how life works on this planet. Okay, so in the next chapter, we're gonna kind of shift gears a little bit, and we're going to talk a little bit more about DNA and about how DNA functions inside of us.